There are many misconceptions in the popular view of the Great War, but none that pervade so strongly as the image of callous generals living a life of luxury and sending their men to die in fruitless suicidal assaults. The view of the Chateau General is perhaps most famously espoused in Blackadder Goes Forth, where the imbecilic General Melchett is established quite safely in a chateau and has no apparent idea of where his men are or what opposition they face. Please note that throughout this video I shall be speaking of the British situation in the war, as it is in Britain that this opinion seems to be strongest and where the majority of my sources stem from. The reality of the situation in the war was quite different to that which is widely believed. British generals were frequently seen in the line alongside their men, and even their headquarters were far from safe from return enemy fire. Lieutenant General S.H. Lomax, for example, was mortally wounded alongside 5 of his staff officers when the chateau he was using as a headquarters was hit by German heavy artillery during the First Battle of Ypres. Lieutenant General C.C. Munro, who had joined him to aid and direct in the battle, was lucky to escape with a heavy concussion. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle described the incident as a brain injury to the army, an apt term for the loss of several highly experienced leaders. Casualties amongst men of major general rank and above were at least proportionally equal to those of non-commissioned rank, whilst officer casualties as a whole were higher than other ranks. And in fact, Field Marshal Haig had to pass an order forbidding senior generals from approaching the front line later on in the war, as losses amongst experienced senior officers were far more difficult to replace and were severely damaging British High Command. The craven accusations of cowardice and incompetence levelled against British senior officers pale when passed under even the most cursory glance at the hard facts of the war. The 224 men of brigadier general rank and above killed or wounded in the conflict bear silent testament to the courage of all ranks in the war. Many generals had been decorated highly for bravery in previous wars, and were recalled from retirement to serve again following the end of prestigious careers, and were to pay the ultimate price for their return to the lines. 10 of the generals killed had earned Victoria Crosses for the most conspicuous gallantry, and many more were to serve with distinction, even without earning the highest of accolades. Given that the average British general was just as brave as the men that he commanded, whence then stems this misconception of the higher ranks being detached and cowardly? In their remarkable book, Bloody Red Tabs, General Officer Casualties of the Great War, which I highly recommend reading, Frank Davies and Graham Maddox explain that some of the earliest concentrated aspersions against the British senior military command stem from the memoirs of wartime Prime Minister David Lloyd George, which were published soon after the death of Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig. In the memoirs, Lloyd George was fiercely critical of the High Command and extraordinarily self-aggrandising. His criticisms often have little basis in reality, accusing generals of absenteeism regardless of the number of deaths amongst their number, and also recommending alternative courses of action which run contrary to military common sense. Davies and Maddox go on to explore how certain famous anecdotes about officerial ignorance have little basis in fact, and provide a far more thorough dismantling of the myths than I have time for in this video. The misconceptions that pervade in Britain revolve particularly strongly around the Battle of the Somme, which remains to this day the bloodiest day of the British Army. I intend to do a full video about the myths of the Somme at a later date, but suffice it to say that the ideas that persist are more than slightly removed from the truth. The writings of Winston Churchill, in his book The World Crisis, have been highlighted as the beginning of this idea in the public eye, however. Writing from a position moulded by his prejudices of the time, having just been dismissed as a cabinet minister for the utter fiasco at the Dardanelles, for which he bore the blame, if not entirely fairly, Churchill, in the words of historian Gary Sheffield, showed a blithe disregard for what was possible in 1916 and an astonishing lack of understanding of the realities of combat on the Western Front. The British Army that embarked upon the Somme offensive suffered particularly from a lack of trained officers, having only recently adopted the European General Staff model of leadership and operating at a pre-war size many times smaller than their contemporaries. Every trained officer thus counted, and each one lost represented a loss of expertise that could not easily be replaced. Britain could only field 447 trained staff officers at the outset of war, 219 of whom would be killed by the end of the conflict. This shortage of trained officers resonated within the rest of the army, as Britain struggled to field a force of numerical equality to the Germans. Many of the mistakes made throughout the campaigns on the Western Front were as much a result of facing a determined and powerful foe with an army of raw recruits as one led by men who were still becoming accustomed to leading so great a force. Churchill's criticisms of the Somme offensive, as Sheffield attested, stemmed from his lack of appreciation for the limitations inherent in such an army, compounded by his own frustrations at a personal lack of involvement. In addition to the outright lies and misinformation spread by embittered political contemporaries, there are several other factors at play in creating the image of the Great War general that still so pervades the modern view. The most important is the incremental decline in so-called heroic leadership that had been taking place since the advent of gunpowder. In essence, as weapons increased in range and lethal power, the danger to the general became so great that to lead from the front was no longer a viable option. As I have already mentioned, however, this danger did not deter many British generals from getting themselves killed or wounded through a sense of obligation to their men. But their place, no matter how heroic their actions, was not at the front. Hand in hand with the evolution of weapons came evolutions in communications and logistics that in turn allowed armies to grow in size. The enormous armies of the mechanized age could not be commanded by a few heroic individuals on horseback leading from the front. With wireless allowing for near instantaneous reception of information and transmission of orders, and railways allowing for the rapid movement of forces, a commander was now more of a manager than a leader. Due to the cumbersome nature of the command equipment, when British officers went to inspect the front line, as they so often did, they were effectively cut off from their headquarters, and thus incapable of actually commanding the huge numbers of men that they were responsible for. If one were to criticise the British generals, to do so on the grounds of their not being present at the front would hold far less weight than to do so on grounds of their putting themselves at such unnecessary risk as to threaten the leadership and fighting capabilities of their forces. Yet such accusations would ring hollow when one encounters the enormous morale effect that their presence could have for their men. For example, the Victoria Cross citation from Brigadier General Sir George William Grogan, which reads as follows: "For most conspicuous bravery and leadership throughout 3 days of intense fighting, Brigadier General Grogan was, except for a few hours, in command of the remnants of the infantry of a division and various attached troops. His actions during the whole battle can only be described as magnificent. The utter disregard for his personal safety, combined with sound practical ability which he displayed, materially helped to stay the onward thrust of the enemy masses. Throughout the 3rd day of operations, a most critical day, he spent his time under heavy artillery, trench mortar, rifle and machine gun fire, riding up and down the front line encouraging his troops, reorganising those who had fallen into disorder, leading back into battle those who were beginning to retire, and setting such a wonderful example that he inspired with enthusiasm not only his own men, but also the Allied troops that were alongside. As a result, the line held and repeated enemy attacks were repulsed. He had 1 horse shot under him, but nevertheless continued on foot to encourage his men until another horse was brought. He displayed throughout the highest valour, power of command, and leadership." Brigadier General Grogan hardly sounds like the kind of man who spent the war reclining in a chateau far behind his men whilst they suffered the privations of battle. More succinct is the special order issued by Brigadier General Hugh Jamieson Elles, champion of the Landship Corps and commander of the Tank Regiment, on the eve of the Battle of Cambrai, who stated simply, "I propose leading the attack of the Centre Division." He indeed led the attack from his personal tank Hilda, flying the standard of the Tank Corps, which attracted his vehicle more than its fair share of enemy fire. It is interesting to note that Lieutenant Mitchell, MC, who took part in the action, observed in a later book that Ellis's action was reckless, stating that a general's place in a modern battle is well to the rear. The myth of the distant Great War general is one that deserves no place in the modern understanding of the war. There are a great many brave and selfless men who repeatedly put themselves in harm's way through a sense of duty and honour that would have resonated with military leaders throughout history. That such a stance ran contrary to military sensibilities of the time, and put them in more danger than was really appropriate to their position, is, perhaps, a much more deserving criticism than the frankly untrue notions of cowardice that currently pervade. Historian Richard Holmes observed that it is abundantly clear that British generals of the First World War were more likely to be killed in action than those of the Second. To brand them as cowards through a misunderstanding of the affairs of the time, or belief in defamatory assertions published after the fact, is a frankly contemptible stance, and one that must be opposed for the memories of all those killed and maimed for the sake of the eventual victory.